This video was shot in 2012. Since this time, the Canadian Association for Community Living has changed its name to Inclusion Canada.
Put more, and the province of Canada can put more pressure on the government to keep the institution closed, because institution is not the way to go. Community is the way to go. People with disability have the right to be in the community just like everyone else.
Hi, my name is John. I started my journey with People First about 40 years ago, and I want to tell people the history of People First and the journey People First Canada has had along the way to become the organization that it is today, and how it's impacted my life as well as the lives of many other people with intellectual disabilities in this country.
I don't think that the majority of Canadians have bought into the idea that people with intellectual disabilities have the same rights as everyone else.
And I believe that everybody is sort of on the general road and the general path in terms of our movement and those that make it up. People are different stages in it. But that's why we need People First, to be able to challenge the organization as a whole.
Everybody is a person first. It doesn't matter who you are. You're a person. And then whatever's wrong with you, whether you got a hiccup or whether you got a headache, or that comes secondary.
What we just heard was about the importance of being a person first and being seen as a person first. When I first got involved in People First, we started out on a People First of Canada project with different advocates from around the country coming together to talk about forming a People First movement. But Bruce Capel from Ontario, who was working at that time with CACL, can give you a better perspective on what happened before that.
My understanding is that David Lincoln, who was a leader of People First of Ontario, and Jacques Pelletier, who at the time was the executive director of the National Institute, and Peter Lawless, who was with Health and Welfare Canada, talked about getting funding for an idea that David had to found People First of Canada. No one talked to anybody in the Consumer Advisory Committee or in other People First groups about this idea. So when they heard about it, they were really, really worried, because provincial groups weren't that strong, and in many provinces there weren't any provincial groups. And they thought that rather than get money to found an organization, they should get money to develop an organization, to bring self-advocates together to strengthen and develop provincial organizations, and then with strong provincial organizations found a national organization. So Barb Good and Peter Park were primary leaders in that. They asked Marjorie McPherson, who was a volunteer with CACL, and myself, to help them develop a proposal. And we did that, and it got money. And Peter and Marjorie and I were responsible for hiring the first staff members. So BC, I think, is talked about mainly because of the conference. That was the first time that self-advocates made a presentation at a conference, and some folks from Oregon and Washington State heard about it, and then they had a conference, and that's where the name People First came from. I mean, even going back to that conference in British Columbia, where Joe Dickey, who was a parent and a leader of CACL and became president, was in the forefront of putting self-advocates out front and legitimizing their voice.
What Bruce was just talking about was the start of People First of Canada, but it wasn't always easy. For the Eve case, for example, Eve was a young woman who was seen holding hands with a boy, and her mother wanted to get her sterilized. And she went to court, and it went to the Supreme Court of Canada. Now, what was unique about this was that People First and the Self-Advocacy Committee of CACL took this on and became interveners in the case. So when Eve won the case, which means that no one can be sterilized against their will, the Supreme Court of Canada recognized the importance of the voice of self-advocates and People First.
I think the Eve case was such a watershed moment, such a defining moment for our association and also for People First, because as in a number of ways, that, as we know, that was the first time that self-advocates went to the Supreme Court of Canada.
I thought was pretty important at the time was to kind of engineer David Vickers, who became the lawyer, to meet with the Consumer Advisory Committee. And, you know, at that time, the Consumer Advisory Committee was the place where leaders of People First met. So while it was, that was a Consumer Advisory Committee action, I think it was really a People First action. So, with the Eve case, the divide in CACL was the president of CACL at the time was a physician and a parent, Dr. Ron Christie, who was in favor of parents being able to sterilize their children. And he didn't want CACL going to the Consumer Advisory Committee wanted CACL to take the case. And it was CACL that refused. So then it asked for the support of CACL for the Consumer Advisory Committee to do it. So that was, it was on whether you agreed with parents being able to sterilize their children or not. That was the divide. So in some ways, I think the fight for legitimacy and recognition may have been harder within the movement than with the Supreme Court of Canada.
One of the key issues for People First is deinstitutionalization. People are locked up in institutions for no other crime than they were born. People were locked up because of their disabilities. Deinstitutionalization and closing of institutions is important, and the key to deinstitutionalization is providing the right supports in the community. If people are supported better, and if funding goes to the supports as opposed to being institutionalized, then deinstitutionalization can happen. In Nova Scotia, for example, there are more people locked up in institutions than any other province or territory in Canada, and that is wrong on a lot of different levels. And we have proven time and time again through members who have been institutionalized that we can live in our communities with the appropriate supports.
I think we're still trying to undo these centuries-old assumptions that People who live with the label of intellectual disability are, not, fully human. That, it's part of the same struggle, and I think people have talked about this, that women went through to be recognized as full persons. That in this country, African Americans went through to be recognized as full persons.
What a lot of people don't understand about the role of institutions is that it had to do with the lack of power, not individual characteristics. So it had to do with, people were labeled because they were homeless. People were labeled because they were young women who got into trouble and were institutionalized. People were labeled because they had medical conditions. People were labeled because they caused trouble. Some people were labeled because doctors, said they've got this kind of IQ. But it was a very wide net. So, what's miraculous is the numbers of people who weren't institutionalized, not that any one person was institutionalized.
That institutions had so taken away people's right to make their own decisions that you needed, if you gave people some control over their own resources and some planning assistance to help them make a plan for their life and negotiate their way into the community, that would give them a right to exercise their self-determination and make their own decisions. For people with intellectual disabilities, that was the great confinement started, back in the 17th century, and earlier, 15th century. In some definitions of what it means to be a full human being, you had to be male, right? You had to be of a certain color, of a certain class, and you had to be able to use your mind in a very certain way, right? Demonstrate that you could think, communicate, verbalize, and that what mattered to you was this certain range of things, and that would be what defined being a human. And so gradually these assumptions about what it means to be human were undoing in order to recognize the full diversity of all of us, that we're all different, we all have our own path. This one around intellectual disability and people with psychosocial disabilities seems to be the hardest nut to crack. We still haven't fully cracked it.
Dr. Martin Luther King civil rights movement, and I think he inspired a lot of people. When he was a little boy, the clerk wouldn't let his father buy a pair of shoes for his son because he was black. And then, he said, Martin Luther King said, "What is wrong with me?" And I think people with disability feel the same way. What is wrong with me? Well, it's nothing, to no fault of your own, it is nothing wrong with you.
I have a disability, but I am not disabled. Nothing says that better than when the Canadian Association for the Mentally Retarded changed its name to the Canadian Association for Community Living. People first objected to the word retarded, or the R word, because of all the negative stuff it brings up. And it does hurt us. And so we were instrumental in pushing CACL to change its name.
People first learned about, didn't want the name, and we looked at 2, 3 different names, I've forgotten how many, bunch of names anyhow, and we settled for 2 at first. Then that was brought. No, it's the Consumer Advisory hasn't changed its name yet. It was brought back to them, and we worked on it in conjunction with them. Then by this time we'd established an advisory committee of People First, National People First Project, and it was brought to that, our steering committee or advisory board, whichever you want to call it, and anyhow, it was narrowed down to one, and that was community living.
That pushback from People First, and People First wasn't yet a full organization, you're still in the, I think the project had started, but I think that really signaled why an independent organization was so critical. And that simply having a committee of the board, like the Consumer Advisory Committee, wasn't enough.
The worst thing about the whole thing is that a lot of people who voted against the name change did so because they didn't think it was important. And they did not recognize the hurt that the label caused people, and did not respect, people who've been labeled saying this hurts. So I think of all, that was, nobody ever came out and said that. I don't believe you, I don't respect, but that's what their actions said. There were a number of reasons, and some people resisted for only one of them, and some people resisted for all of them, and some people resisted for one of them, but used another argument so they didn't look bad. So one argument was to change the name of any organization runs the risk that people won't know who you are or what you stand for. So confusion over identity. Another argument was that it would be costly. So if you change the name, you've got to change all your registrations and your stationery and all that kind of stuff. And another argument was not so much against changing the name, but having a non-labeling name. So some people may have been okay with changing the name, but not to a name like Community Living, because it didn't say who the organization worked on behalf of. Those were a lot of the reasons.
When People First across Canada, all across Canada, started saying the same thing. They wanted people themselves.
Now, some people would say the association lost some support, particularly financial support, through the name change, and would say that's still the case because people don't know what community living is about. And my experience is when I worked for what was then called the Canadian Association for Mentally Retarded, nobody knew what the organization was about either. They thought they did, but they didn't. So.
Like the first year that it went to the annual general meeting, we were defeated. I remember coming back bawling like I don't know what, because it was defeated. And then the second year when it was defeated, that year I was pissed off. Even though there was a resolution that said, okay, no later than 6 months is there to be a special general meeting dealing with nothing but the name change. And then when the vote was taken, a private vote or whatever you want to call it, where you didn't have to be accountable, it was defeated, and then somebody said, okay, let's hold a vote that everybody votes according to their conscience, or whatever you call it.
Professionals, parents, and others would engage people who've been labeled in the debate, basically saying, we don't respect your statement of being hurt by this. And if it hurts you, of course we'll change it. That would have been the decent response. That's a 5-minute conversation. My God, this hurts you? We ought to stop.
Why do you think there was so much controversy around the name change, in your opinion?
I think it was partly because people were comfortable with that. Most people in the community wanted something that they were comfortable with, and they didn't understand how it made people feel. Just hearing the words, they weren't ready for. Well, maybe they were ready, but they didn't realize it. Ready for change. And then naturally the corporations and they'd say things like, oh, the funders won't know who we are, where to look for us, how are we going to get money, how are we going to raise funds. That's beside the point.
And from a fundraising, marketing perspective, you wouldn't have gone down that path. But CACL did the right thing, because the human rights cases that we'd been involved in up to that point, the thinking, the values that the movement had adopted around equality, were very much that it wasn't an issue around trying to fix people. It was about changing the community.
And being part of our community is what it's all about. People First was instrumental in demanding our right at the table, demanding our place in the community, demanding that we have the same rights as everyone else. We're no different than anyone else in our communities. We have the same wants, we have the same needs, and we just want to be a part of the community and not segregated away in large or even small facilities.
The Consumer Advisory Committee became more than a committee. They claimed that the early movers really claimed their identity as people first. The label jar is not people. And demanding a voice, and demanding that no decisions be taken without their voice and perspective. Demanding more control, demanding that we go to the Supreme Court on the Eve case, demanding a name change. That totally drove the transformation of the organization. I don't think we'd be where we are today without that drive by some really, really courageous people on the Consumer Advisory Committee.
So, and why? Why do you think People First is important?
Well, I think it symbolized and I think became a kind of rallying point for people who've been labeled to speak up, to come together, talk about issues, and then speak clearly about how they stood on those issues. So particularly at a time when People First was just forming, the voices of people who'd been labeled were not recognized, often not respected, and People First brought people together so that voice could be stronger.
I think that had been shown in the Eve case, that CACL itself had to be able to be challenged. because while it's trying to break down barriers, it can still, some of those old ways of thinking can still be part of the organization.
We all communicate differently. Plain language is important to people first. It's a form of accessibility that allows us to be a part of our community. Without plain language, or more importantly, clear and concise language, living in our communities becomes more of a challenge. So plain language, how does language affect people's abilities to participate? Do you believe?
Fundamentally, any barrier to someone understanding what's happening to them and what's happening around them gets in the way of their making good decisions, having good reactions to what's happening. Language is one of those. And in some ways, I think is it's one of the most difficult barriers to overcome. Because plain language can only bring it to a certain level. And in plain language, you often lose the real meaning of what's being said or decided.
Advisors, they're important to our work. They're needed to support people in order to do strong advocacy work.
A few years ago, there was a project across Ontario, and there were 3 communities, and one was in Brockville. And part of the work was to assist the redevelopment of the People First group there. So that was my job to do that. And I worked with Gord Ferguson, who's the president, and we worked together. And we did some planning at the beginning. We brought people who've been leaders and thought about why People First is important, and what do you want to do, and who are you going to ask to help, because you need support to do it. Everything from very practical things like how are you going to get people to meetings, to who's going to pay for the taxi fares if you live in a community like, where you don't have buses. And out of that project came some important learnings, and one of the learnings was that People First, for a local group to be really strong, and I don't know what you think about this, David, is it's not only the members and an advisor, people to help, but it's helpful to have some other people out there who can just help with practical stuff, like drives, like getting the word out, like helping people get the meeting.
I think in some ways it depends on the issue or area of expertise. But generally, I think good advisors are advisors who understand the values of People First, who understand how to build community, and also how government and service works. Good listeners, respectful of the voice of People First, are comfortable working in the background, not in the foreground, and know how to help people make decisions rather than convince them of a decision.
They're there playing a very respectful role. They offer advice if they think it's appropriate. But some advisors, like they don't understand that maybe the person only needs emotional support. Like, I know I need emotional support. I can't. well, better off with a person being there, so that there's something, call it my security blanket, whatever you want to call it. They're, my way of thinking, to offer their assistance, and it's a case of, okay, if I want it, if I think it's a good thing, if it's what's happening, well, okay, then maybe I'll use part of it. Maybe I'll use none of it. But that's up to me. I've got information, what I do with it, that's up to me entirely. And anybody, I respect that.
The Association for Community Living is a parent organization where People First is a self-advocacy association. One of the struggles in the early day was figuring out our roles from the well-established association over People First, and figuring out, instead of doing things for people, but doing things with people.
We're an equality seeking organization, we don't worry about that, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but are you really equality? When you're saying equality, do you do it tokenistically, or do you really mean equality?
From my perspective, CACL is primarily a family-based movement. People First is a movement, founded by people who've lived with the label. And so we had a division of labor.
But in reality, what does that do? That they say, oh well, they have a council set up to so that the board knows what the consumers want. Well, the board no longer listens to them no more than it does me, and they don't listen to me. So it's a double-edged sword. Most of these associations bring in consumers or People First members for one reason. They want to look good with funders. So they get extra brownie point. I call it extra brownie points if they have a self-advocacy involvement committee or council or whatever they call them nowadays. They get extra dollars.
So they were even in 1998 suggesting CACL should go out and support local self-advocacy groups, which is People First's role by then, right?
Yeah.
And it's got its local chapters. So the tension about roles, I hadn't realized it had gone on so long, but it really did go right up until 2000.
That's part of the reason for the memorandum of understanding. So if people say People First is the official voice, then the question, the real question is, and Bruce Uditsky from Alberta asked this question when I remember Paul and I met with him to try to say, what about these self-advocacy committees? Because they take a lot of resources, money from People First, and leadership, right? And people get confused. People get confused. And what Bruce said was, the challenge is, how do we have an autonomous People First, strong People First movement that's all on its own, that runs on its own, but also have a community living movement that is inclusive and listens to people and respects people and has people who are with disabilities included. And it's a challenge.
The autonomy paper brought out, forced people to really look at what does equality mean. The fact that, okay, you're on a level playing ground, level 2 is bring out making everything, all of it, just like I said, equal. Whether you're top dog on the totem pole or whether you're the lowest at the other end. You're still equal. The association gets funding from the Ministry of Community and Social Services. It wouldn't take up a rally saying that FBA, or ODSP, the social assistance is too low, and is poverty, below the poverty line. It wouldn't take up that, join that rally. If you did, you were told you're no longer a member of the association, blah, blah, blah. Now that's a real far out example, but that happened. And the general rule, associations don't have the time to really provide appropriate support to, and it's going to be individual support, so that because an individual needs change, they can't be one size fits all. Like.
So, how can we be accepted in our communities? Being a part of our community isn't just about being in an apartment, isolated from all the other people. It's about creating an inclusive society where people live together, work together. The best way to teach our communities about the needs of people first is to actually be a part of their communities. Because the more people are exposed to people first, the more they become accepting to our communities.
I think more people need to be educated, more schools need to be educated, because there's a lot of kids who are bullying people with kids who are bullying people with disability. I think we need more improvement.
I think that there's been a recognition in the last 10 years, that the large institutions absolutely have no place. And I think that's been, and we've continued the job of getting the big ones closed. I guess my big concern is that the group homes still remain on the map as a kind of accepted form of support for people. And this assumption that we need to build special housing stock for, special people. There's going to be affordability issues, availability issues, but the job should be to assist people to access the housing market. And because that's going to give them more control in their lives, largely, and enable them to be recognized and recognize themselves as, other members of, just like any other member of the community.
Well, back then, according to most of the people, institutions were wonderful, best things in sliced cheese. Now, today they're seeing things differently. They're saying, well, yeah, but there are better options out there than institutions, and that's the usual. And they're less costly than institutions, and it's having people in the community that's better yet. So they're beginning to look at these different options. I think that's because I was saying that song way back when. People are starting to see, hey, there is. Way back in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, they were downsizing institutions. The government is, because of the political pressure that's the ACL, or whatever they were called, AMRs back then, were putting on. They were forcing them to downsize a bit. And they were thinking, well, we're going to start having group homes in the community, smaller homes of however many residences was the word they were using then. That was in the 70s, early 80s, they were using the term residences. This was about 12 people or 16 people. Then they decided, no, not residences, what we're looking for is group homes, where there might be 4, 8 people, 8 being the maximum number of people living together. So that they built a bunch of group homes in the 80s, and people were moved to these group homes from these institutions. Well, that was fine for them. And now, gradually, people were moving out of the institutions. Where were they going? They were going to the community rather than to the group homes. And gradually, over time, the government was saying that it was cheaper to spend for people to live in the community with support. So they were, mind you, we had some very strong allies like Community Living Ontario, CHL, the different big guys that talk to the government. The government will pay attention to them. They won't pay attention to people first. Who was saying, close the damn places. What were we doing? Yeah, we were saying close them. With sports for people to live in a good quality of life in the community. But we weren't going to the political level. It was the big allies that went to the political people that, and there were people like few people that helped us get to be at that table where they were being talked about. And Bruce, for instance, he knows a political realm or whatever you call it. I'm not into that. But he was one of these people that helped us maybe get on board, that doesn't want to take credit for it.
And we're not going to see any changes if we get more improvement. Because I think a lot of people are afraid and to ask, and a lot of people are keeping their head in the sand. So with the institution that is open in Nova Scotia and Alberta and Manitoba, we need to have more improvement. We need to educate more public.
That life is better for more people with disabilities in Canada. I think that's beyond question. We know that 30 years ago there were 30,000 people with disabilities in institutions, I think. Is that right? 30,000?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
And so, there's less than 1,000 now. And so obviously, if you look at a major symbol of the oppression of people with disabilities, that's changed. But I think that even though people are treated better for the most part, a lot of the attitudes stay the same. And so a lot of people think that people are included in the community just because, it's a nice thing to do. I don't think that the majority of Canadians have bought into the idea that people with intellectual disabilities have the same rights as everyone else.
Well, I just hope that it continues along the same lines as it has been going, and it has people that have good values on it. But I'm afraid that, say, after we've passed on, and there are no people like myself that are people with good values, that people think, well, it's fashionable to sit on the task force, and, well, not realize that, yeah, there's a lot of work to do it too. Now you'll hear me say, close them with proper supports so that people can live a good, not just a good life, a good quality of life in the community, whatever that happens to be, because each person is an individual, each person takes a different kind of support.
Thank you so much for watching. I couldn't have done this video without a number of people I have to thank. First of all, the Carroll Institute for providing funding for this video project. I'd also like to thank People First of Canada, especially Shelley Fletcher and Catherine Rogers. And Catherine was my support person along the way in doing this video. I would also like to thank Kimberly Smith and also my friend Peter Park, who, when I first joined People First, was one of the first people I met in this organization, and who has taught me a lot more than he'd ever know, and is just a strong leader in this movement, and is known as the godfather of People First. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good day.
Didn't think I'd come this far. At some point I stopped counting the minutes, the days, the months. Everything blurred so softly. Ooh, I think I see the clearing. Ooh, just up ahead a little, more ways to go. It's almost the end. Made it this far, just round the bend. Ooh, I think I see the clearing.
That's a wrap.